Hello, everyone. Welcome to the National Cybersecurity Student Association monthly webcast series. My name is Gustavo Hinojosa, Executive Director for the Student Association. Today's webcast topic is the perceived impact of barriers to retention on women in cybersecurity. This session will present Dr. Carl Willis-Ford's results from his dissertation research on the retention of women in cybersecurity industry. The cybersecurity industry has a gender gap, with women making only 10 to 50% of the United States cybersecurity workforce, while making up about 50% of the general workforce. One of the reasons for the disparity as low as of the retention rate of women in the industry. Results presented would help women entering the industry, as well as companies that are hiring women into cybersecurity, be aware of what factors can impact their desire to stay in the cybersecurity and how to recognize and manage those factors. So at this time, I'm going to hand it over to Carl.
Good evening, everybody. As Gus said, this is Dr. Carl Willis-Ford, and I'm a solutions architect currently for GDIT. I've been, in the tech industry for 30 plus years. Used to be a nuclear reactor operator on fast attack submarines, but have been in federal contracting IT since 1997. And got my doctorate in information assurance last fall, and my doctoral dissertation was titled "The Perceived Impact of Barriers to Retention on Women in Cybersecurity." And I, tried to make this a little bit more interesting than just a really dry research presentation. So we'll see how I did. I welcome feedback, and my contact information will be on one of the last slides. So the background of the problem, the basic concept is that there's, well over 300,000 cybersecurity jobs open in the United States, and that number is not going down. If you haven't been to the CyberSeek website, they do a really good job of talking about the job gap in general, but then you can also go into each state and see what jobs are hot, where the jobs are hot, and things like that. So yeah, 300,000 plus cybersecurity jobs open. And then, as Gus said in the intro, women make up roughly 50% of the general workforce, but only 10 to 15% of the cybersecurity workforce. And that was from a study done by Leclerc, Shee, and Abraham in 2014. Recent update that I just happened to see today, a Forbes magazine study was reporting on a study done in 2018, and it's up to 20%. But that's still, far short of what you'd expect to see if we were truly in gender diverse workforce. It would be up, close to or above 50%. So that's basically what got me started looking at the general area. So there's two aspects of why there's gender disparity in the cybersecurity industry. The first is the pipeline, and that is the supply of women entering the field. So fewer women entering the field of study, and then they're not staying in the field of study. So some of the stuff that came out of my literature review, the understanding of do you understand cybersecurity careers? A difference in this study, measured it in 2015 and then measured again in 2016. And for young men, the affirmative response, i.e., yes, I understand what cybersecurity careers are about and I'm interested, went from 46 to 54%. In the same period for young women, it was 33%, and it came up, but only to 36%. So there's a disparity there in that pipeline. And there are some studies out there that talk about the language that we use in cybersecurity, the whole attack, defend, and the aggression based language tends to attract more young men than young women. And young women are more interested in the collegial group-oriented effort, and not as much in the Mr. Robot looking hacker mentality feel of how media presents the cybersecurity industry. cyber competitions such as Capture the Flag tend to have pretty low female participation. The one study that I looked at from 2016 found only 5% overall female participants in, and they surveyed the larger Capture the Flag competitions. So that's the pipeline issue. The other issue is retention. So retention rates for women are lower in STEM fields than non-STEM fields. So 50% retention for women in STEM, non-STEM 80%. Retention rates specifically in cybersecurity. Men tend to be retained at 80% and women only 60%. So even, again, we have a smaller pipeline of women entering the cybersecurity industry, and less of them are staying. And then the last point, after 12 years, 50% of the women in STEM have left the field versus only 20% of women in non-STEM. So here they're comparing retention of women in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, and non-STEM fields. And what Glass, Sassler, Levitt, and Michael Moore found is that women aren't leaving the workforce. They're leaving STEM fields. Now, a lot of the studies that I looked at in my literature review encompass engineering or STEM. Some of them are focused on cybersecurity, but in general, there's not nearly enough studies being done on gender diversity specifically in cybersecurity. They tend to focus more on engineering specifically or on STEM in general. So what I did, looking at the two choices between pipeline and retention, there's a challenge to studying minors, especially if you're a student. And so I kind of said, yeah, I'm not going to try to jump through those hoops. And then one area of interest that wasn't dealing with minors, but I wanted to look at universities and see women who did not stay in the cybersecurity field. They come in as freshmen, they start a cybersecurity study, a field of study, but then leave. I wanted to figure out, well, why are they leaving? But I couldn't come up with a good path to identify them and then talk with them. So instead, I went the retention path. I wanted to look at why women aren't staying in the cybersecurity field. And I think the idea is to really understand how we can close the employment gap. If we could get the percentage of women in the cybersecurity workforce to be 50% or more, I think we'd go a long ways toward closing that employment gap. So the idea was that I wanted to understand what are the barriers to retention? What's keeping women from staying in cybersecurity? So what was I hoping to get out of the study? Organizations could better understand how to modify policy and company culture to reduce their turnover of female cybersecurity employees. What can they do? If you don't understand why they're leaving, obviously you don't understand how you can change things to get them to stay. And there's always anecdotal things like, you'll hear people say, well, I know why women are leaving, and that's there's an element of truth to all anecdotal comments, but without the underpinnings of research, you can't really point to that and say, yeah, we're pretty sure that's real. That's why they're leaving. So this was my conceptual framework. And as anyone who has gone through a thesis or a dissertation knows, you can kind of get into the trying to, as they say, boil the ocean, trying to do way too much work. And this is what I ended up with. This is where I started. I wanted to look at the time working in cybersecurity industry, their current position, their education level, and the nice cybersecurity workforce specialty area, and compare that to what's the perceived impact of wage inequality, imposter syndrome, sexual harassment, hostile work environment, work-life balance, lack of teamwork, and the perception of the hacker culture. And that was going to be way too much effort. I mean, that was going to be a huge study, and I don't know that I ever would have gotten through it. So I went from this down to this. So what I focused on was time in the industry, because I wanted to say, okay, well, let me move forward. So here's my independent variables. So, and these are aspects of the women that are taking the survey. So time working in the cybersecurity industry. Are you, brand new? Did you just join the industry, come out of school, or have you been there for 10 or 15 or 20 years? And what I was looking for here is, are you more satisfied the longer you're in the industry, or do you get disenchanted? How much more likely are women to leave in the first few years than they are in, say, the 10 to 15 year range? Current position level. Are women in management as likely to leave as women who are what they call individual contributors or team leads? How does that affect your attitude towards staying? And then lastly, the NICE, which is the NICE's National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, and they came up with a taxonomy to describe the spectrum of jobs within the cybersecurity industry. So the NICE Cybersecurity Workforce Framework category. And you can see I've got them up on the slide. Securely provision, operate and maintain, protect and defend, investigate, collect and operate, analyze, and then oversee and govern. So some of these tend to be, and I say blue collar, but more hands-on. Some of them are more managerial. Some of them are training and policy oriented. So I wanted to see, how are women in the different types of jobs affected by my dependent variables, which are, these are the barriers to retention. These are, and I had to scale my study down and only pick 3. So after, working through a major part of my literature review, these are the 3 I went with. 1 is lack of mentorship. 2 is imposter phenomenon, and 3 is hostile work environment. And as I learned, and your thesis or dissertation for the degree is a great learning opportunity, and you learn a lot about how to do research, which is really the goal of it. And picking something as broad as hostile work environment wasn't the best choice. I did learn something, but I guess I can say that it gives us the opportunity for much more study to break that into its component pieces. And I'll get farther into what I mean by the lack of mentorship, imposter phenomenon, and hostile work environment in a few slides. So, and the research questions were basically, I'm looking at what's the nature of the relationship between time working in the cybersecurity industry and the perceived impact of lack of mentorship, right? So is there a relationship between how long you've been in the industry and how the woman perceives the impact of not having mentorship to her decision to whether to stay or leave the cybersecurity industry. And then the nature of the relationship between time working in the cybersecurity industry and the perceived impact of imposter phenomenon. Is imposter phenomenon more impactful to new people in the industry, or to people who have been in the industry longer? So you can see the pattern here. So I looked at the relationship between the time working in the industry, the current position level, and the workforce framework category. Each of those tied to each of the other 3: lack of mentorship, imposter phenomenon, and hostile work environment. So, and here we'll get into a better description of what I'm talking about. So mentorship. There's a general agreement that mentorship is important to the career. I wanted to tie into specifically, is that a barrier keeping women from staying in the field? And there's disagreement regarding how important it is to have a gender equivalent mentor, as in women mentoring women. And it's, very definitely in the literature review, they showed that it's much more difficult to get a female mentor as you climb the career ladder, which makes sense because there aren't that many women to begin with, and then as you climb the ladder, there's even fewer. So lower ratio of women above you. Now, the imposter phenomenon I had not encountered before I started my literature review. It's also called the imposter syndrome. And it affects men and women both, but it affects women much more seriously. And the basic idea of imposter phenomenon is, even though there's objective evidence to the contrary, you don't feel qualified for the job you're doing or the job you're applying for. So even if you have, a Security Plus cert, even though you have great job reviews, or you came out of college with a great GPA and you participated in competitions and your teams won, even though you've got that objective evidence that you know what you're doing, you don't feel that you're qualified or as qualified as your colleagues. And one of the examples that they gave in one of the studies is, for instance, a job requires 10 experience. That's a typo. A job requires experience in 10 subskills. Men might say, I have 6, I'm going to go for it and see if I get the job. Where women might say, I only have 8 of the 10, so I don't feel like I should apply because I'm not qualified. And the impact there is, women may actually leave the field if they are convinced that they're not good enough, they're not qualified. And again, additionally, if they're not going for promotions because they don't feel qualified, then they will always be lagging behind their male counterparts. So again, it affects men and women both, but the research shows that women are much more significantly affected by imposter phenomenon. And then we come to hostile work environment. And the reason I said earlier that this, wasn't the best one to choose is that there's so many different things that make up the concept of hostile work environment. There's active and passive components, active as in harassment, passive as in work-life balance or pay inequity. What we saw in the literature review are things like female interns assigned the social or administrative roles in teams, communicating with customers, taking meeting notes, things like that, whereas male interns were given the technical roles. And this, again, isn't every single situation, but looking at the wide aspect, these tendencies were happening. Another study, 30% of women leaving engineering point to workplace climate, lack of accountability. So digging into hostile work environment, or HWE, we see discrimination, which can be active or passive, and unexplained lack of promotion, right? There's 3 people up for the job, 2 guys and 1 woman, and the woman just never gets the job. Exaggerated reports of mistakes or errors, tokenism, you're added to the team because you're a woman, but you don't actually get to do any of the meat of the work. Overt, that should be overt discrimination, where it's very obvious that they're actively discriminating against you. Wage inequality. Work-life balance was interesting. Women still have a larger role in child rearing in the families. So this work-life balance tends to impact married and women with children. And even though companies are putting together some pretty decent work-life balance programs, things like flex time and letting you work from home and things like that, women tend not to participate in these programs because their male counterparts that are, they're all going for that same position, up above, they think it demonstrates a lower commitment to the company. If you're doing flex time or you're working from home or things like that. The good old boy network. This is mostly passive, but it's pretty impactful. And this is, just the fact that the guys get together to go play in the golf tournament, or they get together to go watch the ball game, or they're talking sports, and it's kind of men taking care of men. And if women aren't invited into those social situations, then they're not necessarily in front of the mind when opportunities happen. There's a lot of informal mentoring that happens in those discussions, at those golf games, and having a beer after work, those kind of things. And then sexual harassment, and this was, again, this was a new idea for me. I understood sexual harassment, but I didn't understand the two components of the gender-based and then the actual sexual advance. Sexual advance is the predatory, quid pro quo. I'll get you a promotion if you go out with me, that kind of thing. Whereas gender-based is more of, this job isn't a woman's job, right? But all those components help make up a hostile work environment. And one of the things I learned through my study was that was just way too much to pack into one retention barrier. It would have been better to pick or choose, break them out, and I would have gotten, I think, better results. So my research methodology, it was quantitative. I did a survey. I worked with cybersecurity industry groups through LinkedIn, Twitter, and email, like ISSA, Women in Cybersecurity, Women in Security and Privacy, and things like that. It was a self-selected sample. Basically, I advertised the survey, and women, went to the link Survey Gizmo to fill out the survey. And I had, an open field for time working in cybersecurity industry, radio-style buttons for picking current position level, and the workforce framework category. And then I used a 4-point Likert type scale for the perceived impact of these retention barriers. And validity and reliability, it was a non-experimental study, so I didn't have to worry about I'm administrating once and then administrating again 4 months later, and if there was any echo effect. The survey was available to any woman, and there was a filter question saying that you identify as a woman and that you work in the United States. I did a field test and pilot test of the survey and made modifications based on feedback. And there's an interviewer effect where if you're face-to-face with someone and interviewing them, they can feed off of your reactions if you're not careful. But since this was an online survey, there were no interviewer effects. And this is an example of the impact questions. So you look at question 7, what is your perception of the impact of lack of mentors on your desire to stay in the cybersecurity industry? And that's what I was trying to measure. And your choices were none, somewhat, moderate, and high. And in the instructions, I explained the backgrounds of these. Now, for the results, the impact of lack of mentorship. You could see this is pretty close 50-50 between moderate and high and none and somewhat. So, roughly 50% of the respondents felt that the lack of mentorship affected their desire to stay in the cybersecurity industry. Impact of the imposter phenomenon, definitely over half of the women said it was moderate to high impact. And then hostile work environment was, the most impactful on their decision to stay in the cybersecurity industry. One of the results that I called out is that all 3 of those barriers to retention are significant. On a scale of 0 to 3, the impact of lack of mentorship, mean of 1.5, imposter phenomenon 1.7, hostile work environment 1.9, and overall 1.7. So definitely one of the things that came out is that they are significant retention barriers, and they do have an impact on a woman's decision to stay in the cybersecurity industry. And I found a significant relationship between time working in the cybersecurity industry and the perceived impact of imposter phenomenon. And it was a weak negative relationship, which means as time working in the cybersecurity industry goes up, the perceived impact of imposter phenomenon goes down. So imposter phenomenon has the most impact on early career women. Could be the result of increased self-confidence. You know, as you're in the industry more, you become more confident about what you're doing. You get runtime in the position. But this tells us that we need to focus our anything we're dealing with imposter phenomenon, we need to focus that on early career women. A significant relationship between the workforce framework category and the impact of imposter phenomenon. So oversee and govern was significantly lower than securely provision, analyze, operate, maintain, protect, and defend. Now, again, you know, that is based on the data. Then you look at that and go, okay, well, why do we think that is? Oversee and govern tends to be a more senior level workforce category. The people that are doing that job tend to be more senior and have longer runtime in the industry. So it could be reflecting the same as previous, longer time in the industry, more self-confidence. But it also could be that oversee and govern, because now you're in management, is less technical, more socially oriented, more leadership and management oriented, which again could have an impact on self-confidence, right? You're not just like, well, you know, as I came up through the database ranks, you know, being a hands-on database administrator, and then moved into middle management, you know, the job becomes much less technical. You're relying less on your technical ability and more on your leadership skills, your soft skills. So that might be where this shift happens. Significant relationship between time working in the cybersecurity industry and the overall composite of the perceived impact of the retention barriers. So again, a slight negative relationship. So the longer you're in the industry, the less overall impact of these retention barriers. So the more willing you are to stay in the industry, the longer you're in the industry. And the research talks about something called the settling effect, which means the longer you're in the industry, the more willing you are to put up with things that annoy you. That's the basic idea. So it could be reflective of that, could be reflective of the settling effect. It could also be reflective of the fact that, you know, things like the imposter phenomenon aren't as impactful the longer you're there because you're more used to what you're doing. But these all point to, as you'll see, these all point to other areas where we could dig in deeper in further research. So, yeah, the study added to the body of knowledge about why women stay or leave the cybersecurity industry. So the implications and conclusions. So what do we take out of all this? What can we do? Well, for managers, you know, ensure women have mentoring opportunities. And this ties into that imposter phenomenon concern. There's formal, there's informal mentoring. It's important to impact imposter phenomenon early in the career because that's when it has the greatest effect. Focus on alleviating the hostile work environment issues. Active and passive effects, focus on inclusion. And one of my favorite quotes about inclusion is here: diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance, right? So we can't just focus on gender diversity. We have to focus on gender inclusion. As part of mentoring, make sure that early career women realize and understand the impact of imposter phenomenon, right? If you're an early career woman and you don't know about imposter phenomenon, then you can't necessarily identify, hey, this is what's happening to me. I should, go for that next job. Or I should, convince myself I am qualified to do this because I have this certification. I did this, I did that. I'm getting good job, performance reviews. So I am qualified to do this job. But if you don't realize that phenomenon is impacting you, then you don't know how to counteract it. So I think this could be an important thing for managers to do. Individual contributors, women mentoring women. If you're in the career, if you're in the field, focus on spending time with new employee women coming straight out of college and help them get their feet on the ground. And allies. I'm a big fan of the idea of male allies of women in cybersecurity. And that's a whole different presentation that I'm working on. But all these things that we talk about can be, men helping early career women through this kind of stuff too. So policymakers. Now, policymakers are different than managers because managers don't necessarily set policy for their company. Policymakers, that's the whole point. They're the executives that are creating and setting policy for companies and organizations. So set up informal and formal mentoring programs. Trained mentors with company-assigned mentor-mentee pairings, organization, watching what's going on, making sure that there's diversity and inclusion, making sure the guidelines and policies are followed. Informal can just be encouraging peer-to-peer mentoring programs. Informal, you need to keep an eye on informal programs because they will, in a male-dominated industry like cybersecurity, they will tend to become unbalanced. And you'll have a lot more mentors choosing men than choosing women as mentees. Imposter phenomenon, peer support groups early in the career, new employee programs. You just need to have a focus on how to deal with that. And hostile work environment gets a lot of attention, but not all of those different things that I talked about get the same attention, and they all have an impact. Future research. So here's where we look at the opportunities for, this is a target-rich environment. Lack of mentorship. So how well do we understand the importance of same-gender mentors and role models? In my literature review, I saw that same-gender mentors and role models in high school made a difference as far as young women choosing cybersecurity. The research is indecisive because there's some that fall on either side as to whether same-gender mentors are, important in the job once you get into the industry. A good friend of mine who is an executive coach for women, she and I met and chatted about my research, and she pointed out that there's a difference between mentors and sponsors. And this isn't in my research, but I think it's a valid point that comes out of what I did that could be someone else's research. And, a mentor is someone who gives career guidance. A sponsor is someone who actually puts your name forward for, job opportunities, for tasking and things like that. And sponsorship a lot of times flies under the radar and is informal. And that's another place where the good old boy network tends to have a significant impact. And then looking at the effectiveness of informal versus formal mentoring programs, looking at organizations that have one or the other or both, and seeing what the difference is in how diversity and inclusion are impacted by informal versus formal. For the imposter phenomenon, so what are the details of how time in industry actually affects the imposter phenomenon? Is it really that you have more self-confidence the farther you get in? Is it because you're moving up the ladder and you're getting into less technical, more management, more soft skill roles? I think there's opportunity there to learn more about that. Does time and position affect it the same way? For instance, the longer you're in a specific role, imposter phenomenon might go down, but then when you change roles, does it go back up again? and delve into relationships between the nice workforce framework categories and imposter phenomenon to get a better understanding of why is it that oversee and govern is impacted less by imposter phenomenon than some of the others. Again, is it because of technical? Is it because of seniority, time in the industry, and things like that? The hostile work environment. So I didn't find there was not a significant relationship shown between the retention factors and hostile work environment. Hostile work environment was shown as definitely a barrier to retention, but it shouldn't say between retention factors. It should say between things like time and industry, cybersecurity workforce framework. So in my research, HWE, hostile work environment, was comprised of 5 different factors, which, again, the aggregate, I think, weakened that particular piece of the research. Further research can be done on breaking down those individual factors, or looking at active versus passive categories. For example, is sexual harassment a more significant retention barrier in more junior or technical workforce categories than more senior or non-technical categories? Is work-life balance a more significant retention barrier to women in more junior positions? So there's several different ways we can slice and dice this to dig into, what are the more significant factors, and how do they relate to, again, time in position or time in the industry, the type of work you're doing, things like that. In anecdotal discussions, I heard that there's some people that think that sexual harassment is more of a problem in work categories where you're elbow to elbow working down in the spaces with cabling and wiring and firewalls and things like that, than it is in where you're writing policy and doing training. So there's a lot of research that can be done in that area. And the pipeline, which is not the path I chose, the pipeline has a lot of opportunities for research. Do women leave the cybersecurity field in college? Anecdotally, people will go, yeah, but we need research on that. And if they do, why? Do women lose interest in cybersecurity in high school, and why? We know from research in my lit review that participation in competitions like capture the flag competitions is very low for women, and it's not hard to see the increasing emphasis in those kinds of competitions in high school and college today in the cybersecurity industry. I mean, there's a major focus on those kinds of competitions, and how is that impacting participation of women? Is it has it gone up since that study in 2016, or is it staying the same, or is it going down because of this this increased focus on competition? How does the perception of cybersecurity work as a hacker mentality affect young women in choosing cybersecurity as a career? Is that perception still there today? Is it changing among middle school and high school women? I saw some studies that say that a lot of kids have made fairly firm career choices by the time they're 16 years old. Is there more research that verifies that, and how does that affect when they might want to choose cybersecurity? Are they aware of the cybersecurity programs? Are they already turned off by then? The Forbes study that I mentioned up at the top of the presentation is encouraging, because they say that we're now at 20% of the cybersecurity workforce are women. But that, like I said, that's still far short of the at least 50 that you would expect. So things are better, but there's still a long way to go, and there's a lot of research that might help us help inform organizations and schools on how to help close that gap. So this is the first time I've given this presentation, so I hope I didn't run through it too fast. I finished a little earlier than I expected, but here are references. These are just the ones that I referred to in the presentation. Obviously, in my lit review, there's many, many, many more. But I really, it was very much a learning experience for me going through my literature review, which, you know, that should be the case. But it was an eye-opener for me. And then here's my contact information, my email, LinkedIn, and there's a link to my dissertation. If you'd like to read it, it's out there at, you know, no cost download. I didn't believe in charging people for it. And Gus, I don't know if there's a ability to do a Q&A.
Yeah, so we have a few questions. So the first one, in my own casual research in this area, I found that barriers to retaining women also apply to people of color, and of course, women of color face intersectional barriers. Did any of your research sources include this racial diversity barriers?
Yes, absolutely. And this is the challenge. Is when you're doing a dissertation, your advisor will kind of beat on you to say narrow it. And you know, there's most definitely everything I talked about here, all the retention factors would definitely apply to people of color. And the impact, they face many of the same challenges and different challenges within the cybersecurity industry. So you know, my future research list, you know, you could just take that and bring it over to you know, people of color and women of color, and that just shows you know, the extensive amount of research that is available and open that needs to be done. Because quite frankly, you know, when I started looking at this, I was really surprised with all the chatter you hear today about gender diversity and diversity in general in cybersecurity, and how little research there is out there specifically about cybersecurity diversity. So it really surprised me, and that's, you know, why I wanted to jump in and do this, you know, to try to add to the body of knowledge. But I did not specifically focus on people of color or women of color. I was just looking at the gender gap, but there's a lot of potential there for learning about how to make things more diverse and more inclusive in this industry.
Great. One more question. So some men are avoiding cross-gender mentoring because they're worried about you know, the Me Too movement, and that further hurts women by denying them mentorship opportunities. What approaches can we use to encourage men to mentor more women?
So, you know, I look at that kind of, you can do it the same way they do it in doctors' offices, right? You know, you meet in a coffee shop. You meet as a group. You can have 2 or 3 people being mentored by the same person, and then, you know, you can have one-on-ones, you know, in more public places. There's a lot of ways to get around that, if you have the desire to make it work. You know, and I understand. It's in the news right now. You know, there's governor candidates down in, I think, Mississippi, who there's one who just refused to be interviewed by a woman reporter, and because he didn't want the perception. And you know, and I kind of understand that, but at the same time, if he really wanted it to happen, he could make it happen. So and it's a great question because I hadn't thought about it. But yeah, I think, you know, there are, again, if there's interest in making mentoring happen, it will work. And there's plenty of ways to get around those kinds of issues and barriers.
All right. Do we have any more questions from the audience? We do not. So I'd like to thank everybody in attendance, and Carl, thanks for presenting your dissertation research with us. We'll be posting this video on YouTube, so if anyone wants to share it, we'll be sending an email also with the YouTube link. And thank you everyone for attending, and Carl too.
Yep, and please reach out to me with any questions or comments. I'm happy to continue the discussion.